The following podcast is banned in the state of Florida for talking about a dangerous leftist book, the Bible. Like the Bible, this podcast contains frank discussions on sensitive topics, including sex, violence, and cursing. Please proceed with caution. You will save a lowly people, but you will humble the haughty eyes. You, O Lord, are my lamp. My God, you make my darkness bright. With you I will break down an enclosure. With the help of my God, I will scale any wall. This is the word in black and red. Hello, and welcome to The Word in Black and Red, where we read the Bible from a leftist and liberationist perspective to elucidate the way people of faith and their comrades can understand the Bible as a source of healing, love, and liberation for all people. I'm your host, Micah Belong, the wise old Lama Emby, joined today once again by the wonderful Derek White, W. Scott McCandless, Matt, and of course our wonderful friend Al, who is so generous and willing to come on to so many episodes with us. Now, I'm going to go ahead and jump on into the text. Exodus 2, verses 1 through 10. Now the two midwives respected God, so they didn't obey the Egyptian king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. So the king of Egypt called the two midwives and said to them, "Why are you doing this? Why are you letting the baby boys live?" The two midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They're much stronger and give birth before any midwives can get to them." So God treated the midwives well, and the people kept on multiplying and became very strong. And because the midwives respected God, God gave them households of their own. Then Pharaoh gave an order to all his people: "Throw every baby boy born to the Hebrews into the Nile River, but you can let all the girls live." Now a man from Levi's household married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that the baby was healthy and beautiful, so she hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she took a reed basket and sealed it up with black tar. She put the child in the basket and set the basket among the reeds at the riverbank. The baby's older sister stood watch nearby to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, while her women servants walked along beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent one of her servants to bring it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child. The boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. She said, "This must be one of the Hebrews' children." When the baby's sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Would you like me to go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter agreed. "Yes, do that." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I'll pay you for your work." So the woman took the child and nursed it. After the child had grown up, she brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I pulled him out of the water." So this passage is a much shorter story, and it is the foundational sort of preview for what's going to happen for the Hebrew people throughout the rest of this text. But I'm going to go ahead and stop my introduction there and and offer it up to y'all. What are y'all's take on this little story of the baby Moses being left out in the Nile and rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and coming back to his family of origin to be raised, but now as Pharaoh's grandson?
Well, the first thing that jumps out to me is this is entirely a women's story. They're the only actors in this whole story, in this whole part of the chapter, are the women. They are the ones who control the entire narrative. They take charge. And coming out of the episode, as we have, just talking about the midwives and how they work together to save the nation, once again, we have across ethnic, religious, linguistic boundaries, women coming together to oppose oppression and genocide and all that bad stuff.
Technically, instructions were followed to throw a baby into the river. They didn't say don't do it without bubble wrap.
Yeah.
So,
Bitumen and wrap.
The first recorded malicious compliance. I will do exactly as you say, Pharaoh, just with a little bit of bitumen.
I don't know. I would say Tamar might have been a little bit earlier maliciously complying.
Well, maybe, yes. Good point.
But malicious compliance is exactly what Jesus said to do.
Mm-hmm.
So this story
Preach.
definitely reminds me of the paralleling to like Jesus saying, oh, if they tell you to go with them a mile, go with them for 2. Just be a little shit. Come on. Malicious compliance is another means of sabotage, which is the perfect way for a subjugated people to rebel.
Yeah, that's how powerless people fight back. Yes.
And to do it safely, without violence, which is what we want to be doing.
Yeah, this story follows pretty much directly from that command to now throw the babies into the river. And I think looking at the commentaries, there's maybe a couple of stories that got put together. I think we're meant to read them as one, where we have this escalation in the first chapter, expecting the midwives to kill the baby boys that are born. And then when that doesn't work, Pharaoh says, okay, throw them in the river. And so now we've started this new story with that in the background, where we do have that happen. But it's in a very different way. And I have a lot of things to say, so I will try to pace that rather than front load all of that. But just to preview some of those things, I think there's a lot of good identity theology going on. I think there's a lot of parallels in other folklore and the way this kind of story is taken up in the Hebrew text and the points it tries to make. And just a plug for the book of Exodus in general is, in American Christianity, this is the book that became the textbook of liberation for the abolition movement. And this is the book that became the textbook for liberation theology. And so it is a great place to start reading these things. And it also sets up a lot of the themes that are going to continue throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament.
I think it's really interesting that Moses and his family are descendants of Levi, who killed Shechem's entire town, genocided all of the men, and then took the women and children as a prize. And let's be real, that meant slaves. They would become like the secondary and concubine wives. Yeah. And it would be from that family that like then there would be redemption, and then there would be the correcting of that action that happened all the way back, way further back in Genesis before Jacob becomes Israel at all.
I love that observation. The fact that Levi did this awful thing and then descends into slavery, and this redemption arc, this resurrection, is that his descendants, the descendants of the guy who absolutely did this awful thing, and yet out of him come the leaders who will liberate his descendants.
It makes me feel more hopeful as a leftist that we can continue to redeem ourselves from the sins of our fathers and to correct those things that happened so long ago, but that still affect us. Because, I mean, Levi enacting that affected the whole family throughout the rest of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Generational trauma, woo!
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that angle, but, you know, as you mentioned what Levi and Simeon did, and that affected the family, one of Jacob's fear was how he would appear in the land. And I'm thinking back, this is an fully unformed thought, but I'm thinking back to the beginning of Exodus 1 and Pharaoh's fear that if war should break out, that the Israelites will fight for their enemies. And I'm remembering how Pastor Kuma talked about this, is that maybe he's thinking, I don't know Joseph, but I do seem to recall these guys chopped off a bunch of people's dicks. We really don't want them to be fighting against us.
That was just when there were 2 of them.
Right. And so not that justifies enslaving people, but maybe that fear is not entirely unfounded, that, yeah, you don't want them to come fight against you.
The dick removers. Those are not who you want as your enemies.
I just love the observations that we've already heard. That's what's been running through my mind, this malicious violence. That's just such a beautiful thought that, you know, we see this happening, and that is intimately a female story. I do find strange that in the previous chapter we see midwife's name, which is rare in texts like that. But we don't see Moses' sister named in this text.
Or his mother.
Or his mother. They remain nameless. And for me, that's where the text gets kind of odd. You know, in the first chapter, we see women put in this great place. And in the second chapter, we see a very female narrative, but we don't even see Pharaoh's daughter named. And so you begin to wonder, did the redactors have a little trouble with that? It's like, hey, wait a second, let's not give them names. But, you know, that to me is problematic, that they're not given names. This is Moses' sister, Moses' mother. This is Pharaoh's daughter. It's all in relation to the men in power. That said, what we do see is we see Pharaoh's daughter going against her own father. We do see that there are people in the halls of power who rebel against their father. And I'm remembering a movie, and I mentioned this in a sermon once, and many of your listeners probably aren't familiar with this movie, but it's a movie that came out in the 80s called Dragon Slayer. And the premise of Dragon Slayer was that there was a dragon. They had to send a virgin to every year, and the dragon would eat the maiden. I don't know why dragons ate young maidens. It never made any sense to me, you know. But there's a scene in the movie, and there's two women who are paralleled in the movie. One, her father dresses her up as a male the entire time to keep her from ever having to enter the lottery. And the other, who's also kept out of the lottery, is the king's daughter. And the king's daughter believes, like everyone else, that she was put in this lottery. And somebody finally comes up to her like, are you really that naive? No, the king's kept her name out of the lottery every year. And so she goes, when the next lottery comes up, and puts her name in the lottery, and puts every chit in there is for her. And so when they go to do that, they pull it out. What she's done is she's subverted her father's power. And I see that parallel with what's going on here with Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter, in her own way, is subverting her own father's power because she knows what her father is doing is wrong. So that gives us hope that God would raise up people, maybe the children of some politician, maybe the child of some wealthy person, maybe Elon Musk's children who names these horrendous names. Maybe those children could rise up and subvert the power, the evil, oppressive power of their parents. So there is hope in this text that maybe someone close to those halls of power would subvert the system.
Makes you feel good. Elon Musk's daughter definitely hates him.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. I know that. That's why I use that as an example.
Talking of daughters, I have thoughts on why the only person who has a name in this story is Moses.
He's the
Really-
anchor baby.
Really quickly before you go there,
Mhm.
I want to make the point that I think the pushback that Derek might get on this point is that, yes, Pharaoh's daughter resisted his rule, but instead of resisting it in a way that would actually be systemic, that would solve this problem, she resists it in the individual, right? And decides to take care of this one particular situation, this one particular child.
She's Andrew Jackson adopting that Native American boy while participating in mass genocide.
Yeah, exactly. It's giving Sandra Bullock in The Blind Side. Like, she absolutely fundamentally changes the life of Moses, right? But does she solve this problem? Now, I think the pushback to that that criticism is, well, yes, because she saves the person who saves the entire civilization. Maybe we don't
like Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And sometimes when you're in a place like that, you do all that you can do. Maybe that's the only power she had as a daughter in Pharaoh's house, where the lineage isn't matriarchal, it's patriarchal. She knows that her power is limited, but she can do this one thing, pushing back against dad's policy about all the Hebrew children. But see, that's the thing also that we can look at is, we were talking in the previous episode about how the rich people will always get abortions when they need them. Just like that football player, I forget his name, that was running for office in Georgia, and he's like supposed to be the pro-life football player, and found out that paid for abortions for women, and one woman had to cancel the check. Wealthy people will always get what they want. And this wealthy father gave in. Okay, yeah, I've got this policy in place. So it also teaches us that the wealthy people, the people in power and the people in control will also always make exceptions for themselves.
And I think the healthiest perspective we can make of Pharaoh's daughter here is maybe she takes in Moses and that softens Pharaoh to the rest of the Hebrews. We don't know if this policy continues or if this policy was a one-time, Herod-esque scenario where Herod tried to get rid of all the Hebrew babies at once, or if this was an ongoing campaign. I read it as an ongoing campaign because she hid him for 3 months and she didn't think that it had passed. But I think that maybe this is the thing that actually got Pharaoh to stop committing a genocide against the Hebrew people, because he actually had a Hebrew kid running around. Maybe that changed his mind. We also don't get any indication that it did. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable to criticize Pharaoh's daughter here on the one hand, and to say that she was doing all that she could, or possibly imagining that she's doing all that she could.
But there's another aspect to the story too, but that she takes him in. Presumably he's to be raised as an Egyptian, but guess what? Moses' sister slips in this agent who's going to be his wet nurse, and ultimately, who has the greatest influence on who Moses turns out to be? Is it his adoptive mother who's raising him in the Egyptian culture and religion, or is it this nurse who probably spent way more time with him, who told him the story of her people? Which one had the greater influence? Somehow that subversive message got in through there, and that is all thanks to Moses' sister. So everybody plays their role here.
Well, we all know rich people don't actually raise their own children.
And that, the wet nurse has the power. There's power in that role too, right?
Yeah.
What, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world? Isn't that the expression? Yeah.
Well, and we were just talking before the podcast about the fact that the actor John Lithgow was babysat by Coretta Scott King, so that's why he's a great leftist now.
I do want to go back to something that Derek said about, can understand the interpretation that it's not cool or chill that the authors of Exodus decided to not name the focal point woman of this chapter. But I'm choosing to interpret it in a more, every woman kind of way, where, they don't need to be named. They're more archetypes of many women. They're all very positive figures. Even if Pharaoh's daughter may be problematic in her wealth, they're all doing a good thing. And any woman, any person can resist and rebel against horrible genocide through malicious compliance and subversion.
And solidarity. Let's throw that word in there.
And solidarity.
It's these women standing together, each according to her means, that really ultimately subverts everything.
And I feel like it's a lot less of a Sandra Bullock-y kind of vibe for Pharaoh's daughter to, she knew this was a Hebrew child. It came from the water. And choosing to take that in when her own father has been like, kill all these young boys, that's really true generational rebellion. Like, she was an Egyptian princess. She was sequestered away in her own little hidey hole of patriarchy and subjugation. But she did what was in her power to, like, take care of somebody. Because, I mean, if she actually, like, verbally stood up to her dad, being like, this is wrong, you shouldn't do that, I mean, it would be super easy to just put her to death. Problem solved. Pharaoh's had lots of children. There was other daughters, like, and also, you know, like, it was a patrilineal, patriarchal society. Only the boys counted anyways. So, yeah, I think Pharaoh's Daughters is not too bad, even if the vibe is giving a little Sandra Bullock-y from a modern reading.
Sure.
I like the interpretation that I think there's two ways to read Pharaoh's daughter agreeing to let the girl go and find a wet nurse. I think the first way is to say the very straightforward, a girl approaches her, says, I can solve this problem for you. And she's like, yeah, go do that. And like doesn't know any wiser. But I think given that she recognizes who he is, she realizes what's being done here, the fact that she's willing to take this courageous stand leads me to believe that Pharaoh's daughter says, yes, do that, because she recognizes that this little girl has been following this baby for a reason.
I agree with you, Micah. Pharaoh's daughter knows she's returning Moses back to his family. Because what are the chances that some random Hebrew girl pops up while you're taking a bath in your private palatial spot on the Nile? You know, like, it's a little too convenient.
Yeah, I think that she is returning Moses back to his family on purpose, because she knows that despite, you know, to keep him alive, she'll have to adopt him. But for now, she can at least extend this kindness and probably save his life in the short term as well.
And pay her. Let's not forget this, too.
And pay her.
Yeah.
Yeah, she actually gets paid for her labor, which is, I think, the only time a woman has been paid to raise her own child in the history of ever. So
No, there have been some experimental instances of that, but
I could give you some good examples when the welfare state works like it's supposed to. And I see the welfare state in inappropriate context, because the welfare state used to not be a bad thing. It actually originated during World War II in England, caring for the poor children who were dispossessed because of the bombings going on in the UK. But the example I'll give you is a very good friend of mine, lives up north, and their daughter was born with cerebral palsy, and the state paid her to be her daughter's caregiver. And of course, that was at a time when we weren't cutting funding for all of this. So it does have, and it should, but I'm one of those people who support universal basic income.
I mean, it's bizarre that people are opposed to welfare. Like, the literal word is goodness. Like, I am opposed to the well-being of you. I'm opposed to your well-being. Well, what is a blessing? It is the wishing of well-being towards someone else. So what is its opposite? A curse. So if you're saying that you're opposed to the well-being of someone else, if you're opposed to someone else getting welfare, you are literally cursing them. Like, this is so fundamental to the conservative project, I think, that you would rather curse the poor than bother to have a responsibility to them.
That's because they think they're going to get less. That's what they're taught. That's what the system teaches them, is that they will get less if the poor get more.
Yeah, sorry. Let's go back to Matt, because I interrupted Matt like an hour ago.
Yeah, so I think the reason that people don't have names except for Moses in this particular story is for literary reasons. So the documentary hypothesis, pretty common but not unanimous position in scholarship, that different stories in these first 5 books of the Bible especially are coming from different sources that have been put together a certain way. And so it would be weird going from chapter 1 to chapter 2. We know Shiphrah and Puah's name, and I forgot everyone else's, even though this is primarily an oral culture and we're really good at remembering that stuff. But I only remember Moses's. But then in other places, Miriam is named, Jochebed is named. And so we know that the people putting this all together know their names. The literary reasons I think this is, there's a couple. So one of our wonderful members of the community on Discord pointed out some parallels to the story of the legend of Sargon. I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but the Mahabharata epic is a Hindu epic of very, very similar stories. And I think the more obvious parallel that I think is very probable that the Hebrew text is responding to is the legend of Sargon, because that comes from Mesopotamia. We know there are other Babylonian texts that are in conversation. And so Sargon's mother doesn't have a name in that story, but also gets put in the water, sent down river in a basket that is sealed with bitumen. And so I think that's part of it. The other reason I think is relationally. So we know that there's a Levite man at the start of this story. And so he's descendant of Levite. He married a Levite woman, and the boy has a sister, and Pharaoh's daughter has a father. And we know all of these relations that these people have in this story and how they relate to one another. So Moses' mom sets him adrift on the river to preserve his life. Miriam follows by. Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby. And when she takes him in later on, she gives him the name Moses. And this is a great example of just one of my side things. I think there was a real Moses. I think he was maybe more of Egyptian origin than Israelite, or at least there was some Egyptian myth stories surrounding this guy, and we pasted on some other stories because Moses is an Egyptian name. And there's a thing that happens sometimes in the Old Testament where they add a Hebrew pun. And so the CEB, Common English Bible, I don't think does justice when it says he was pulled out of the water. Other translations say he was drawn out of water. The Hebrew word for draw is masha. And so that's the pun, masha to masa, I think is what the Hebrew is for Moses there. And they're false cognates. So people who study language, I took French in high school, false cognates, they sound alike, but they don't mean the same thing as opposed to a real cognate. Orange is the color orange in French, and it sounds like orange, and that is a real cognate. And so there's this pun that exists that they create and they paste on to claim this story as, no, this is a Hebrew story, this is an Israelite story. But it's an Egyptian name, and it's an Egyptian name that usually shows up in compound. So Ramses, the city that gets mentioned earlier, is son of Ra. There's an Egyptian named Thutmoses, son of Thoth. It's kind of like Johnson or Davidson. So Pharaoh's daughter takes it back and gives us this name. Moses basically is like, I don't know where this kid came from. I don't know who his dad is. Like, who is this kid? It's basically effective giving him that name without anything attached to it. And so I think in creating those relationships, everyone is defined in a relationship, and we get to Moses and we fail to do that. He's given this name that just basically says, this is this kid that we found. And this identity of who Moses is going to be and who he's going to belong to, you know, when he murders the Egyptian and then a couple of other Israelites reject him. And these kinds of things, I think, kind of haunt him throughout of who really do I belong to? He's really got his feet in a couple of different worlds that he's living in, or that people are at least seeing him living in. That's why I don't think they have names. I think it's for very literary reasons because they know them. But I think where they're pulling on this other story, which in other contexts, it makes sense to serve the purpose of the story to draw attention to what Moses' name is and his identity kind of being undetermined, at least in the tension of the story and the narrative.
I like that. I like that a lot because I like what you had to say about Moses caught between two worlds. And that points us toward God's inclusivity, that God is trying to include multiple worlds there. I mean, that's just a thought that came to me as you were saying that. but it is the idea that God is not just limited to one people or one place. I'm trying to remember this quote I came across when looking at these passages. Where is it? Well, the general idea is, they said it much better than I did, is what is subversive about Moses in the story is that Moses is pointing us toward a God who includes everyone. I mean, for example, Scott mentioned this in the previous episode about how the midwives, we're not sure if they're Hebrew or they're Egyptian or they're a mixture of both. And it's the idea that these people are showing us in a period in history when gods are very tribalistic. Elle brought it up when talking about the Roman Empire. You can worship your gods as long as you worship the Roman gods, but this idea of a God who includes all people of all tribes and of all nations is a very weird concept. It's not tribalistic. It's about a God who is inclusive of all peoples. And while that idea is something we sometimes hear in churches, we still tribalize our religion. We tribalize our faith. We tribalize our God. Evangelical culture is really bad about that. You know, we talk about my Jesus, my personal faith, instead of looking for a faith and a belief system that includes all peoples, no matter how different and how varied they are. And so when we see a God who uses these midwives, when we see a God who has a Moses, who's his daddy? Who's your daddy, boy? Your son of who? Who are you, Moses? And that's the point. Moses is, in essence, the son of God. He is, in essence, a precursor for us who are Christians. And I'm not trying to subsume or use replacement theology. Please don't misunderstand me. But it's the idea that we are all called to a God of care and love and support. And that just continues to blow my mind, because that's not the faith that I originally came into. That's how my faith was evolved. As a God who wants to include all peoples, no matter who they are.
Well, and I love that connection, because it is a reminder that, like, Moses' name is absent here because we also don't know God's name yet. Like, God has obviously been a character throughout the book of Genesis, obviously. We see God show up as YHWH, the tetragrammaton that I don't pronounce out loud. We see God as showing up as Elohim, as El Shaddai. But really importantly here, God shows up. The only time that God gets a name in Genesis is the only time that any human being has ever named God in the text, which is Hagar, naming God the one who sees. And here God is continuing to see. God is seeing this misery that's happening in Egypt. We will hear in later chapters where God describes the sound of the wailing of the people of the Hebrews going up to God and disturbing God, and God not being okay with it, and so calling Moses to go and make sure that they escape. And so Moses is, son of no one. He has a father. His dad's name is Amram, but he doesn't get associated with his father. It is just a man from Levi's household married a Levite woman. No one is named here in this text, in this little bit of the story. It is just Moses, because Moses is the son of no one. He is this in-between culture person who will go on to learn the name of God. And when he learns the name of God, that is when he gets his purpose. That is when he gets his grounding. And that is when he will go on to bring about the salvation, by which I mean the liberation of his people.
I was thinking about something stupid. Jesus' dad was Joseph, and Moses is predicated by Joseph. Coincidence?
Well, no, not at all. And and who is it that delivers Moses but Miriam, and who delivers Jesus? Mary. So So no, it's not coincidence at all.
Well, I was pausing to say I think not,
Oh,
but
sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, you say
coincidence? I think not. But go off, Micah.
Wait, sorry, I was really excited for this perfect segue to talk about my bullshit. The first 7 chapters of the book of Matthew are really all about establishing Jesus's bona fides as the proper coming after the next person after Moses, after David, and after the prophet Elijah, because Jesus is supposed to be the fulfillment of all 3 of these people. So again, this is not a supersessionist reading. We as Christians are reading a New Testament that is deeply informed by these stories. And so what happens? We have a king who says, I'm going to kill all the baby boys. And so his family has to escape from that scenario. Well, where do they go? They go down to Egypt, and they only return back to the promised land when it is safe to do so.
But we'll get into that more as we continue
Yeah.
through Exodus.
Yes, exactly. We will talk a lot more about the connections here. But the fact that, the who is it that comes after Moses? Joshua. What is Jesus's actual Hebrew name? Joshua. So there are no, these are not things that were lost on the early church. These are details of the story that are included here. Whether or not they were true, right? They are true for the church because they are the sign that this is a continuation of this Jewish tradition. It is not that Jesus has come to replace the Jewish tradition. It is that he has come to continue it. And in his words, to fulfill it. That does not mean that it is done. It means that he has done Judaism right. And because he has done it right, we are all invited to be a part of God's people as well.
I have a great meme idea now.
What's that?
Have you seen the meme where it's like, hey, can I copy your homework? Yeah, sure. Just change it up so it looks different. That's Exodus and Matthew. That's what I'm going to do. That's just for you. That's for you.
Yeah, it's a meme just for me and Bart Ehrman.
This idea of Jesus being the fulfillment of Moses, of David, of Elijah, bringing us into that is what allows us to be brought into that story. I think it's also worth noting the way the text brings other stories into the narrative of God's people. And the parallel I want to look at, so bringing back up the legend of Sargon, that was mentioned in the Discord community by one of our wonderful members, Faye, who I believe is going to be on some later episodes. So they will, I'm sure, talk about these things better. But I started reading up on this. And this is one of those myths coming out of that same region that became the Babylonian Empire. And we know that the Enuma Elish shows up in the first creation myth. We know it shows up in the flood narrative. We know that the Epic of Gilgamesh shows up in Jacob's narrative at times. And so I think Legend of Sargon is a little bit in the background. His mother is a priestess of Ishtar, and she has a child that she, for whatever reason, needs to conceal the child. I could only find this in secondary sources in time for this episode, but she needs to conceal the child. She finds she can no longer conceal the child. So she puts him in a basket that is sealed with tar, sets it adrift in the Euphrates River. Sargon is found by a drawer of water, which is why I think that pulled out in the CEB isn't the best translation here. But who is a gardener, he eventually ascends to the kingship. So he starts out as one of the people and becomes this, this great warrior king. And so I think a lot of that is definitely in the background of this story. There's a lot of parallels that are, ooky spooky, if you were the biblical literalist, maybe. And so some of these things where I think also, there's extant myth that's being put together in the name of Moses, and we try to give it a pun, but that's an Egyptian name. The word for basket that gets translated here, one of the weird translation things we do for I don't know what reason, it's an Egyptian loan word, and that word is tabat. And it shows up in 2 places in the Bible, here in the ark that Noah builds. And so I don't know, because I didn't follow scholarship, whether the thought is the redactors of this story are drawing the parallel to Noah, or the people that were redacting Noah drew the parallel to Moses. But there is this ark that Moses is placed in that saves him from the waters of the Nile, which floods every season. So I think there's definitely some parallels there that it's drawing on. But the way that people are able to talk to this story, but kind of reverse it a little bit, because Moses starts out, he gets pulled in by royalty. So he starts in with the king, basically, and he descends to be one of the people. So he has kind of a reverse thing, but he also has a special relationship with God. He comes from a priestly family. So there's all these parallels, but it gets flipped on its head. Where say we like this story, we see some parallels, we want to draw on it, but also as we take it in and we find meaning in this story, we're creating a new meaning out of it. That we don't think our hero should become this great warrior king. God will fight the battle later. We think our hero should be from among us. We think he should share that gift with, 70 or 72 hours. I forget what number, later in the story. It's just a very different picture of who's going to liberate us, who's going to unite us. Because Sargon is this great king that united the whole empire. It is like the first dynasty in Mesopotamia.
Well, what I love about those two connections are, first off, that again, with Noah, that Noah and his family, the few people who go out of the ark, bring about the salvation and liberation of all people because they survive and they are able to rebuild this thing. And so I don't think that it's odd that there's a comparison here that because he was saved by this ark, by this basket, that he is going to be able to bring about the salvation of his people as well. I also love that idea of the condescension of Moses, because that very much so echoes the way that the early church talked about Jesus, that he did not regard equality with God as something to be clung to. And so Jesus did not stay up there in heaven, but instead became a human being. Moses did not stay royal, but instead went out and murdered an Egyptian guard for doing, sorry, spoilers, for being cruel to the Hebrew people. And so he is doing that kind of condescension. He is coming down here to become one of us instead of one of the privileged few that he had been raised as.
Divesting himself of privilege is the vocabulary term from liberation theology.
How come the prince of Egypt lied to me and told me Moses' name meant deliverance?
Well, to draw out is a little bit deliverancy, right? To take out of this place is exactly what God is going to do with the Hebrew people, that God will draw them out of where they have been and into this new land where God is calling them to be.
But drawing out doesn't mean you've got a stamp on you and you're going to be delivered to the place you're going to go. You might be returned to sender after you've been drawn out.
Maybe that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to return to sender, back to Canaan.
They don't have stamps on them. I looked up what Miriam's name meant, and disappointingly I got bitter C. But another source said rebellion, which I like that one a lot better. If Moses and Miriam are named deliverance and rebellion, it's pretty based.
Yeah, I mean, the meaning of draw out that they apply. So, I mean, I was kind of flippant about it earlier, we were just trying to paste this pun on. But that's a way that the redactors or the Hebrew people are adding meaning onto that story, adding another meaning onto that name. And that idea of drawing out being a vision of liberation, of salvation as well. Moses is drawn out of the Nile. He is nestled in the reeds. I think one of these literary parallels, the Red Sea also could mean the Sea of Reeds. So I think there is some parallel in that language, but also they quite literally are drawn out through the water of the Red Sea. So here Moses is drawn out into the household of Pharaoh, and later he will draw the people out of the water away from slavery from Pharaoh.
The other possible meaning of Miriam that I like is that it likely comes from an Egyptian word that means love. And so I like Miriam as rebellion. I like Miriam as bitter sea, as like she is, they have to cross this bitter sea to get to where they're supposed to be going. But I think that the name hangs on and is now the most popular single name for women in the history of the entire world, because it is rooted in love, in this caring for others, that left-handed power, as Derek was describing in the last episode, that protects and brings in. But it is a power that is rooted also in that rebellion, that is rooted in a little bit of bitterness at the way the world is, and instead calls for a liberation for all people, but especially for the particular people to whom she is called. Any other final thought?
Let me just throw out this one and with my narrative approach, I always, when you're telling these stories, you have to work through some things. And one thing that really struck me as I tried to tell this story was the distance between Pharaoh's daughter, and Miriam and the mother. They are separated by so much, right? There's the linguistic boundaries, which is never even tackled in here. How on earth are they supposed to be able to communicate with one another? They speak different languages. And presumably there's got to be some kind, you think that a Hebrew slave can go running up to the Pharaoh's daughter at the river? Come on, there's got to be security. There's got to be some kind of people watching. So there's this huge barrier between these people. And yet somehow they are able very clearly to find solidarity despite that huge difference, despite the linguistic barrier. And in that solidarity, they ultimately take down the power.
Amen.
Amen. One of the commentaries I read suggested that this story in the second chapter of Exodus is one of those stories where God isn't present as an actor. And as you continue Exodus and you get to this part where it says that God remembered the people and the wailing had reached them, you certainly can reach that impression. But I would very much want to push back against that understanding of the text, because I think God is very present in these first two chapters, in Shiphrah and Puah, and Miriam and Jochebed and Pharaoh's daughter, and these women who, without having the chance to conspire, have enacted this conspiracy to preserve life in a culture of death and against decrees of death. And I think that we all need a Miriam, and we all need a Jochebed, and we all need a Shiphrah and Puah in our lives.
My final thoughts are all in the spirit of malicious compliance, and doing what you can to resist the oppression of this world today.
Amen.
I love this story, and I like this pun at the end. I pulled him out of the water, and that's why they named him Moses. And I like that pun because it draws us back to the story of Jesus' baptism, that Jesus even gets pulled up out of the water, because that is what we are all doing. The Nile is an overwhelming place. It is a place that floods and brings life with it, and when it fails to bring life, it can bring tremendous death. We just see that it had caused 7 years of great harvests and then 7 years of famine. We see, if you go today, you see that the Nile is filled with crocodiles and hippopotamuses and all of these other creatures that are dangerous and just lurking out there waiting for innocent babies in baskets to float by for a nice snack. And yet Moses gets pulled out of the water. And that is what we are all facing today. We are facing this pressure from the world that seeks to keep us down with the tremendous weight of all this water above us. And yet liberation is coming because we are being pulled out of the water. And that's what our baptism is meant to be. Being pulled out of the water of the way that the world works and into the way that the world ought to work. The world that we get to build together with God. Well, thank you, Derek and Scott and Elle and Matt, for just being a wonderful contribution to this podcast. We so appreciate you being here and sharing your wonderful thoughts. And you, dear listener, for being a part of this and joining us in our second season. It is just absolutely phenomenal that we have made it this far. I never thought we would, and yet now here we are, starting our second season, exploring the Bible together in all of these wonderful ways. I hope that you will be with us for the rest of the Bible and only expand the number of people who are part of this wonderful community. Now, past Micah, say the profound shit. And thank you, future Micah. The Word in Black and Red is a ministry of the Lamapak Alternative Church, a home for everyone left on the outside. Your contributions help this working-class project invest in better tools and spend time organizing, recording, and editing this podcast. And hey, if you support this 16-year project, we might even get it done this decade. We use Patreon for now, but keep an eye out for when we switch to a more ethical way of supporting the show. You can join in the life of our community in our wonderful Discord, where you can chat with the folks you've heard this episode, find links to purchase our merch, and participate in a spiritual community for everyone seeking to build the kingdom of God. We're also a fun follow on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr, and Reddit. You can find the Discord, Patreon, and all the other ways to connect with us and these wonderful co-hosts in the show notes. Now, future Micah, say the profound shit. And thank you, past Micah. Now go and follow that basket that's going along the Nile to the places where you're not meant to go. And go up and talk to the people who you're not supposed to talk to. And offer them a path for liberation. Offer them a way to subvert the way that things are and build a world as the way things ought to be. So that maybe we can get all of us together to build the world God calls us to build. Shalom.